Good morning. Welcome everyone to our webinar, a deep dive into templates for SharePoint and Teams. I'm Natalie Hawkins, one of the account managers here. Our CEO, Peter Baddeley, will be demonstrating and talking you through how to efficiently maximize your use of templates with ProvisionPoint and support user adoption along the way. We will be holding a Q&A portion towards the end of our session today, so please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go along. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Natalie, and thank you for everyone for attending. So today I'm just going to start off with a few slides, then we'll go into a demonstration, and then as Natalie says, we'll have time for questions at the end, but feel free to submit those questions during the course of the webinar. So today we're talking about templates. We're talking about templates to create different workspace types in Office 365. That might be SharePoint sites, that might be groups, that might be Microsoft Teams, and other associated technologies. So when putting this webinar together, I thought, well, what actually is a template? And I found this quote, and I thought it was actually really good. It's something which is used as a pattern for producing other similar things. So in the context of SharePoint and Teams, it's about saying, actually, we'd like to create the same site and team repeatedly. Why would we want to do that? There's quite a few reasons, actually. Firstly, around documents and files, we often find that people want to store files consistently, consistently file them in a structure, maybe making it easier to find, organize, understand those files. We're maybe using them for those templates to manage something consistent. That might be a project. Commonly it's a project, but it can be other things. A marketing campaign, product development, business launches, whatever it might be. We want to do something in a repeated way. We want to ensure that the files are structured, our tasks are structured, other information is structured all the same. Now that consistency helps in a couple of ways. It helps with things like regulatory compliance. So maybe you're in a specific industry or a specific sector, construction, engineering, professional services, legal, financial services, where you need to ensure that your information is consistently stored and structured to maintain specific compliance regulations. Consistency also helps with the user experience. It's easier for users to move between different projects. They can easily find information and they can easily store information as well. And then the extra element is actually making it self-service as well. So how do we actually use these templates? How do we empower our employees to be able to go and create new sites and teams from those templates very easily? Now, I recently wrote a series of blog posts actually about what people commonly store in their templates. And I've pulled out some of the highlights here. And we're thinking about both Microsoft Teams and SharePoint sites. So the sort of things which we commonly see are things like structures of channels in Teams with associated apps. That might be Microsoft apps, Planner, OneNote, Office. It might be third-party apps, or even custom apps which you've developed yourself. You want them consistently stored. Maybe in terms of SharePoint, we're storing lists to manage risks or issues, or we've got different document libraries to store project information, financial information, emails, for example. And then we're enhancing those document libraries with things like content types, site columns. Maybe we're leveraging things like the content type hub, manage metadata. And then finally, maybe on our SharePoint site, we're presenting certain things. We're using web parts, we're including other informational pages to make up that template. So where does ProvisionPoint 365 come in? Well, we help with the process of managing those templates and creating those sites and teams from those templates. So we deal with the initial creation of sites and teams, as well as the ongoing lifecycle management, which I'll touch on briefly today, although it's not the main focus of our webinar. We enhance templates. We leverage things like PMP technology. as well as the Microsoft Graph to create new sites and teams from these templates, but able to enrich those with dynamic information, maybe applying a project code or a customer number or a department division to add intelligence to those sites and teams which are created. And then finally, we also allow you to implement rules around security, whether that's how or if that workspace is shared with external parties, or who has access to do what internally with a new site and team created from one of these templates. So that gives us a little bit of an introduction. Now let's go and have a look at a couple of scenarios, one using SharePoint sites and one using Teams. So I'm going to use two users for my demonstration today. Firstly, I'm going to use a user called Adele. So she represents my end user, my employee, maybe my project manager, who wants to create a new site or team. She can do that through the ProvisionPoint Workspaces app. We see that here. In the app, she'll have the ability to create a new site, team, group, planner plan, Yammer community from templates which have been configured in her instance of the app. So those templates can be different for different organizations, and each template can then apply different settings, different structures to the sites and teams which get created. So let's start off by looking at a new SharePoint site. So I'm going to come in here, and in this case, I'm creating a SharePoint site for each customer. So I'm going to put in my customer name. And you'll notice here that I capture additional information about the site which I'm creating. Again, this is all customizable. So I can come in here and I can define the data which I want to capture. A bit like, for instance, if you were configuring a SharePoint list. We can also configure who are the main people who are going to access and work in this site at this point. So let's say it's Adele. Let's say it's Megan. And I can even add a project team here. So let's put in Christine as well. And I'm going to go ahead and create this new site. Now, I'll show you shortly how we can also introduce things like approval processes as well here. So we can control the creation process, we can control the approval. Now, things you'll notice straight away as this site is starting to create is I've applied a naming convention to this. So information from my request, for instance, my project code, can be used in various aspects of how my site is created. So for example, applying a name. It can also be used to apply specific metadata or even configure certain web parts. If we click on the info tab here, we see more details about this site. So we see things like the metadata being captured here, and we can even come in and change that. You'll notice the site URL with a specific naming convention applied. And if I return to the directory, I can go and open up my site. And it's been created already. So we notice there's my naming convention applied. And again, I've applied a specific name to my URL. You notice I've got a nice layout of my homepage here with different web parts. I'm even showing that same information which is captured in ProvisionPoint directly on my site. Often people want to access that key project information there. And I can even interact directly with the ProvisionPoint Workspaces app from within the context of my site. What else do I have here? Well, I've connected it to a hub site, so I've got a consistent navigation. I've also applied my corporate blue color scheme. Down the left-hand side, I've got several document libraries. So one here for emails with some specific columns, and also one here for documents. You notice here I've got a folder structure. And if, for instance, I go into one of the folders, and let's say I actually go and upload a file here. So I've got this project plan here. And if I go and upload it, notice a few things. it's being tagged. So that project code, which we set when our site was created here, is being set as a default column value. Really useful for if we're going to apply search rules. And there's many other things which we can do here as well. For example, if I go and have a look at my specific library, you see that I'm applying a retention label automatically as well. So this retains my content. So I'm leveraging native Microsoft experiences, but controlling and applying how those are applied. So that's a quick and simple example of requesting a new SharePoint site from a template. Let's go and have a look at a Microsoft team now. So returning to the ProvisionPoint Workspaces app, actually let's show you this directly inside of Teams. So we also do have a Teams app available. So if you're working inside of Teams, you can come in here and you can request a new team using this experience. In here, I can again select a template. Worth pointing out that the templates are controlled by permissions, or everything leveraging Active Directory, so you can decide where those permissions are applied and who has access to request a specific site or team from a template. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to name my project. Notice here we can control things like security and privacy. So is it private or public? Do external parties have access or not? So in the case of this template, they do. Other templates might not. On the right-hand side, I'm collecting additional data about my site and team again. Actually, in this case, it's the same, but it can be different for different templates which we use. Things like dates can be used to control the lifecycle processes, and I'll show you that towards the end of the demonstration today. When I'm ready to, I'm going to go ahead and create my new team. Now you notice in this case, it's pending approval. So we can choose with different templates whether we want approval processes or not. Let's briefly show you an approval by using another user called Megan. We can see here in her email that she's got an approval task assigned to her. And in the ProvisionPoint Workspaces app, I also see that approval task. I see that Adele requested it, and I can see all the details of the request. You can manage approval in different ways. So for example, you could manage that via named users or groups. Alternatively, it could be the manager of the user, or based on some of the metadata. So for instance, if it's a specific department, in this case sales, that could route approval. What we're doing is we're taking that template which we've designed and built, and we're then managing a process of creating it and requesting it and approving it. We can have multiple steps of approval as well. Now, while this team's going to go ahead and create, I'll just show you a little bit about the admin experiences in ProvisionPoint Workspaces. Megan's one of the administrators. So you can see here she's got access to the different templates. Here's the project site template, which we created earlier. And here's the external project team, which we're using at the moment. A few just key highlights to show you today. We can, for instance, say, well, what type of workspace are we going to create? So at ProvisionPoint, we support SharePoint sites, subsites, SharePoint sites connected to a Microsoft 365 group, a Microsoft team, a planner plan, and a Yammer community. And you can have multiple templates for each service type. Down the left-hand side, you'll be presented with various configuration options dependent on the type of workspace you're going to be creating. So in this case, we're creating a Microsoft team. That allows us to create and set things like channels within our template. We can support both standard channels, as you see here, and private channels as well. With private channels, you can control the security and who has access to those channels. You can also configure things like apps and tabs. So for example, a planner plan, a OneNote, notebook, as well as previously mentioned third-party apps, custom apps. We can also define things like our planner plan. So whenever we're creating something which creates a group, so a Microsoft team, an Office 365 group, we can define the planner plan or plans which get created. That includes default buckets, default tasks which we want to configure in those. We can do things like dynamic configuration. So if we want to automatically assign those tasks to someone which we specify when we request it. Maybe we ask a user for a lead engineer or a project manager, and we'll assign those tasks automatically. A couple of other quick things to show you. We can also define the security settings. So we see those here, things like is it private, is guest access enabled, is external sharing configured. We can also apply things like sensitivity labels. And finally, we can also control those names which get applied. And these rules run across both sites, groups, and teams. Any of the data from our request can be used dynamically. That, for instance, includes the project code added as a prefix to the name of my team. We could have used a department or any other information which you configure, and it's important to emphasize the fact that that data is configurable. And so we're then enhancing that template with that data. Let's now go and have a quick look at our new team, and we can see some of the structure which has been applied. So back in Microsoft Teams as Adele, we can start to see my team has been created. It's applied that naming convention. It's applied that structure of different channels. There you see my finance channel, that's a private channel, and my meetings and my generals channel is then specific to or standard channels. We can also then configure the different elements of the team. See our planner plan. So here we go. There's our planner plan with some default buckets and default tasks included. The final thing which I wanted to briefly mention, although it's not the focus of the webinar today, is also lifecycle. So I'll show you this on a site which has been previously created because visually it's easier to see. You see here we've got this element called the lease. So as well as controlling the creation of new sites and teams, we can also apply a lifecycle policy. That lifecycle policy can control when that workspace will be automatically archived. Now, we do have other capabilities allowing owners to extend that lease, but visually you can see here that this lease is about a third of the way through the process. And when it reaches the end, if one of the owners doesn't extend it, then in that case it will be archived. So that allows us to manage the whole life cycle of sites and teams created from our templates. Let's return to our presentation. And I'll just wrap up with a couple of final slides, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So just to highlight a couple of the things which we talked about today. Firstly, we looked at, or secondly, actually, we looked at our Microsoft Teams and teams created from a template. So we talked about a number of common things which people look to apply when they're using templates, and we demonstrated some of those. So that was things like applying the name to our team, applying a structure of channels, configuring default apps, and folder structures. We saw similar things when we looked at a SharePoint site. So that included a structure of document libraries, a navigation and a theme applied, as well as configuring different web parts on the page. We talked a little bit and showed a planner plan. So I showed that in the context of a team, but that also works exactly the same with a SharePoint site as well. So we can include default buckets, tasks, and even do things like dynamically assign tasks. And of course, there's much more. So we can dynamically configure apps. You could set default metadata. We showed that in our document library. We can control security. We can apply things like document retention policies or workspace lifecycle policies as well. And finally, it's worth mentioning that we can integrate with your systems. So that's taking your templates to a next level. Maybe you've created a template for your site, but actually you want a new site or team created each time you create a new customer in your CRM system or a new project in your finance system. ProvisionPoint Workspaces has an API, so it can easily consume data from other systems to then use that data to create new sites and teams from your templates. And with that, I'll see if we've got any questions and hand it back to Natalie.
Brilliant. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions here for you.
Okay.
The first being, why or when should you create a team without a Microsoft 365 group?
Okay, that's a good question. There's a couple of good reasons, actually. The first one is if you don't want or you don't have a use case for the other services associated with the group. So if you create a Microsoft 365 group, you also get things like a planner plan, a mailbox in Exchange, which includes a calendar, a OneNote notebook. If you're not using any of those services, maybe you're moving from on-premises or classic SharePoint, then actually creating a non-group connected site makes a lot of sense because you don't need any of those services. The second element is security. So with a group connected site, you're using the sort of concept of members and owners, and it's very much a delegated security model. So it's really the responsibility of the site owner to then manage the individuals which have access to that group connected team site. If you don't like that model, so if you're more aligned with using Active Directory security groups and the security is managed by IT, then there's not a lot of value in using a group connected site because you won't use the security model which is associated to it. So those would be the two reasons. We support both with ProvisionPoint Workspaces, so we have a mixture of customers using both models.
Perfect. I think you've answered the second question within that answer, which was what are the pros and cons of creating a team without a group?
Mm-hmm.
The other question that we've had is there a free trial available?
Yes, there is. So you can sign up for a free 30-day trial. It's fully functioning. Someone from our customer success team would walk you through the setup, give you some core overview training, and then we'll be able to support you during the course of that trial. And you'd also have access to our technical knowledge base during the course of the trial as well.
Brilliant. I suppose on that subject, what kind of ongoing support is given to our customers?
Yes, all customers have access to the support knowledge base, and also they can log tickets either via email, phone, or through that portal to get assistance as well. We're very much about user empowerment though, so we want to try and make you as self-sufficient as possible so that you don't rely on us, but we're here to support if needed.
Excellent. I don't have any other questions at the moment. We'll probably wait a couple of minutes. So if anybody does want to ask a question, feel free to pop that in the chat.
Okay. Just while we're waiting to see if we get any more questions in, just a brief summary of what we did cover today. So today we looked at how to build rich templates relevant to your use cases. So I showed you an example of both a SharePoint site and a Microsoft team. We looked to how we can empower users with this ability actually to use those templates. So actually how we can make those templates most valuable in terms of someone being able to come in and request a new site or team from one of those templates. And then we showed you at the end a few additional things you could do. So things like apply a naming convention, control security, so both the membership, but also things like external access, whether it was shared with external parties. And then finally, we talked a little bit about expiry and how we can also apply lifecycle policies. So I'm going to say thank you. As Natalie said, we'll hang around and be on the webinar for another minute or two to answer any other questions. You'll get access to a recording. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to us with any questions after the webinar as well.